So my name is Thomas, and I'm going to be talking today about coastal community engagement for equitable and inclusive marine spatial planning. I do apologize in advance. I'm going to be doing rather a whirlwind tour, and I do tend to speak very quickly when I present. Sorry for that. If you have any questions, if you miss anything, if you would like to see the slides afterwards, I'm here all week. Just ask me and I'll send them on to you. Oh, well, that was the end. I don't know what oh, there we are, wrong button. As I said, very quick. So just to give you an idea of some of the issues that I respond to in my work, so this is just an eclectic collection of things. A quote from a study we did last year about the fishing in Ireland, which I think represents the state of the fishing industry in a lot, at least of European countries. Another study we did a couple of years ago responded to changes in County Wicklow, which is south of Dublin, where the coast is rapidly eroding, which means that iconic landmarks, as it says here, can pretty much disappear overnight. This here is an example of how to do something about coastal erosion. So this is a nature-based solution called the Zandmotor. This is in the Netherlands. You also have them in Buitendijk in Norfolk in the UK. And they are becoming increasingly popular. So it's a beach nourishment technique where you dump a whole lot of sand in one place in one go, and then you let it disperse over time naturally. So it's a way of working with nature. Another example of, an example of changes that are not particularly well received by the community. So in Arklow, which is also in Wicklow, they actually wanted to do something about all the damage done from storms, erosion, etc. So they developed a plan, and it was very poorly received by the community. And in fact, the community said the way you're going about this is not only going to destroy the maritime heritage of Arklow, but it's also going to be making it less safe in Arklow rather than safer. And they did that based on their own knowledge of the area. So people live in an area for a very long time, they get to know the area. So they, and I think, successfully challenged the plan. And then this is an image you've probably seen already this week, and you'll see much more tomorrow morning, wind farms, another development in coastal environments. And all of the reason I'm putting all these images up is because in my work, I work with coastal communities, not only on existing connections to the landscape, so what does it mean to live along the coast, what does it mean to live with the sea, but also what is the impact of change. And change can be by accident, it can be erosion, storm damage, etc. But it can also be planned changes. So that's kind of the two categories we see here. Some of the changes are planned, wind farms and nature-based solutions, an Arklow campaign, or an Arklow redevelopment campaign, and some of them are more accidental. For instance, storm damage, but also the fisheries. I don't think anyone is actively trying to kill the fisheries, but all the same, it's not going in the right direction for them. So, as Geert said, my background is in eco-criticism, which is a field of critical theory from English literature. So in that field, I would perform critical analysis of human-nature relationships, and I looked only at coastal marine environments. So you can imagine your books, your fictions, your films, your documentaries, artworks, sound recordings, etc., representing changes in marine environments. So that's what I did for my PhD. And I answered some questions, right? I was trying to answer some questions. What does it mean to be a human being engaging with coastal marine environments, so landscape, animals, objects? And one of the questions I found particularly interesting is, what do you do when the rest of the world starts misbehaving? So I love this image. I actually wrote a journal article about it. What does it mean when the world starts doing things that you didn't expect it to do? When the world has agency beyond the human? And how do we reckon with the impacts of anthropogenic climate change on coastal marine environments? Who is responsible? What does it do? And what does it mean to be alive in a world, as a human being, in a world that is rapidly changing around you? As I was doing that, I always thought there are other narratives out there that are not formal narratives. So when I speak of formal narratives, I'm talking about your fictions, your films, etc. But there are also informal narratives. If you go to a coastal community and you chat to people, then that's an informal narrative. It's a story, right? It's just not a story that's been written down. But you can work with these stories all the same, and they're actually, in my opinion, sometimes the more interesting stories, because not everyone is a novelist, but everyone has a story to tell. You can put that for my slogan. So what I do now, guiding questions in my research: what is the impact of rapid transformations in coastal and marine environments on the communities that live with them? And how can we encourage community involvement in important coastal and marine decision-making processes? And that's where marine spatial planning comes in. So marine spatial planning is effectively a way of trying to navigate all the changes that are happening in coastal and marine environments and getting everybody on board. But in order to understand what it means for something to change, you first have to understand what it means for someone to just be connected to a particular landscape. And that's a large part of what I do now. So one of the prevalent ways of doing that, so the European Union does this, the United Nations does this, they all have their own frameworks for it, but it's through something called ecosystem services. It's a term you've probably heard before. It is a contested term because it implies that natural environments are there to perform services for human environments, for human beings. But other people would argue, look, if you understand what something does for you, you're more likely to protect it. This is one example that's called CICES. It's a framework used by the European Union in particular. And it suggests that there's a sort of a cascade, is what they call it, from ecosystems to human beings. So ultimately you get value out of something. And then CICES also puts a feedback loop in, and that's sort of protecting it. So you know what you get out of it, so then you're more likely to protect it as well. But there are problems with that, right? So one of the problems is double counting. So if you take the example of algae, if you start looking at the CICES framework, I've done it once, I think I counted 18 different services that you could list algae for. Medicine, habitats, aesthetics or non-aesthetics. Well, yeah, you could just keep going like there, and then when you start breaking down habitats, you get another 4 services, etc. It becomes a little bit difficult to really determine what do algae do for us and what don't they do, because I could put them in almost every single category. I was struggling a little bit with religion, but otherwise I got pretty far. If you want to complicate the picture even further, you start looking at cultural ecosystem services. So that it's a category, it's a subcategory of ecosystem services to express the value, the cultural value of environments. Now, anyone who's ever worked on culture or thought about culture will immediately realize how tricky that is, because culture is intangible. What does something mean? It means something different to everyone, and it's often very hard to put a label on it. So, in principle, CES, the fish quote, Fish et al. Quote here is great. So it's a quote that says, CES are a concept around which researchers and decision makers can understand ecosystems in terms of their life-enriching and life-affirming contributions to human well-being. So religion, aesthetics, existential values, community values. But how do you measure experiential, intellectual, spiritual, non-use, etc. values? And that's where it can get very difficult. So there are papers out there that express the religious value of a particular environment by counting the number of church steeples in a town. I think that's a very poor measure of religion. That doesn't mean anything. You don't even know if anyone's gone into that building in the last 20 years. Like, it could be empty. So that's a question we have to answer, right? So if you, especially coming from a humanities or a social science perspective, you often have to kind of justify why you're there, because the natural sciences, there's so many of them. But also we have to somehow find a way to create a meaningful way to engage with culture, to express this is what something means to people and this is why it's important, and to protect its core elements. So that's what I do largely in my research. And there are loads of ways to do that, right? So here's some qualitative methods: participant observation, participatory mapping. You may have seen story maps sometimes. They're quite a popular online tool. You can do counter mapping, which is where you take an existing map and you start challenging it, but drawing your own boundaries and lines on it. Interviews, focus groups, workshops or walk shops, an interesting one where you take people on a walk through a particular landscape. Photo voice or photo elicitation, you ask people to bring a meaningful photo, or you can also do an object along and talk about it. So it's a way to ask people, look, what does a landscape mean to you? Bring something that from that landscape that is really meaningful to you. And then you can use that in combination with other methods. And then quantitative methods, for instance, surveys, which are often something like willingness to pay. How much would you be willing to pay for protecting this particular landscape? I'm a little bit critical, or fairly critical of these methods, but they are out there. Added value experiments, how much value do you think a particular landscape feature adds to the landscape? Or something that you may have seen, especially those of you who work in GIS, is PPGIS, which is where you get people involved in geographical information system mapping. So You ask people to highlight points of interest for them. I have a few examples here. The one on the left is from UCD, actually. This predates my time at UCD, but it's a story map about cultural representations of Dublin Bay by the Cultural Value of Coastlines project. Very much a predecessor to my own work. And on the right is a PPGIS map, so it's a heat map of culturally valuable places as identified by people living in a particular area. And what do we do with these methods? Because obviously you have to measure something. Well, the main way we connect between the humanities and social sciences and cultural ecosystem services, for instance, is through place-based research. So place-based research is a focus on a particular landscape setting. And the concepts that we study include something like sense of place. What is the sense of place that you experience in Dublin Bay or along Dublin Bay when you're walking there? Or place attachments, which is often quantitative. How attached are you to your place, and what do particular aspects of that place mean to you? So you often get statements like, I would be extremely upset if this place were to disappear, or I am attached to the natural beauty of this place, which gives you an indication of natural place attachment. And place meaning, largely qualitative studies, I feel I've left out a reference there, but so going into conversation with people, what does it mean for you to engage with a particular landscape, right? And then you have combinations thereof. So you can bring in place attachment and place meaning in one study, and then you get your mixed method study. I've just put the references in there. If you want the slides at any point, just ask me and you can look up some of these studies. I've put them in as sort of example studies of these kind of approaches. Now for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on two case studies, and there are two previous projects that I've been involved in. And they're both natural science projects in principle. And I think that's one of the challenges here at ReSToRE, is that there are people with loads of different disciplinary backgrounds in the room. And one of the challenges is, how do you bring people with different backgrounds into conversation, and how do you do collective problem solving, right? So the first project was called EcoStructure. It was an Ireland-Wales project, and it explored eco-engineering and biosecurity solutions for coastal adaptation to climate change. What does that mean? It effectively meant coming up with solutions to battle the grey infrastructure along the coast. So when we say grey infrastructure, we're talking about harbour walls, rock wall, jetties, quays, all sorts of sort of cement-based or concrete-based protective measures along the coast that mean that there's less biodiversity, that mean there's less soft solutions against climate change. And there's loads of ways you can do that. So these are some of the examples from EcoStructure. So you can see, even if you just drill holes in a wall, you've now created the nooks and crannies that marine life might use to settle in. The other one is a letterbox crevice. So you can see actually a little blinny in there, a little fish. And the final one, and it's the one that was most used after EcoStructure, are 3D printed tiles that mimic the substrate of the seafloor in a particular area. And these have actually since been put in place in Dublin Port. This is from earlier this year, March 2024. If you go for a walk along the South Bull Wall, which is one of the biggest sort of coastal structures around Dublin, you will see these at low tide. And they were put in collaboration with Dublin Port. Now, as I said before, planned and accidental coastal landscape transformation can have a significant impact on existing people-place relationships, right? So, especially these greening the grey approaches. So that's what EcoStructure does. It's making grey infrastructure more biodiverse. But when EcoStructure did a perception study, a lot of people said, I don't really like it. It's green, slimy. So there's loads of algae growing, right? So they're kind of like, I think it's a health and safety hazard. The kids might slip on it. We don't love it. And that's sort of at a low enough scale, but it does warrant a baseline understanding of what particular places mean. And then you can understand, look, if people go there for their kids to play there, and then suddenly you've turned it into sort of this green slip and slide, might not go down particularly well with community. So what we did was, look, we set out to establish a baseline understanding of two things. We wanted to understand the meaning of the landscape, but we also wanted to bring in the fact that people visit and they go there physically to engage with the landscape. Some people go very often for very long times for particular reasons, and other people go never. So we thought maybe bring these two together, not only the meaning, but also what does that look like in practice, right? So we used a theory called actor network theory. I won't go into it too extensively, but basically what it means is looking at a particular place as a large collection of actors. So you forget about the boundaries between human beings and places and animals, and you just say everything is A, B, C, D, E. It could be anything. I could be A, but the nearby lighthouse could be C. And we're all in a network, and together we form that place. And then effective engagement is the term we used, and it looks a bit vague, but what it actually means is what I said earlier. Every time people and places interact, has a meaningful impact on the relationship. It's just relationship building, right? If I go to a lighthouse once, I'm not going to really care about it afterwards unless something really significant happens. But if that becomes my go-to place and I start interacting with the lighthouse, or I join a beach cleanup community sort of group in the area, or I start to care about it, I start to form a relationship, and that becomes an important cultural place in my mind. And then we studied it using interviews and a survey. I won't go into that too much. The paper is out there for people who want to read it. So where did we do this? We did this in Wicklow, between Wicklow and Arklow. This is south of Dublin, so approximately 50, 60 kilometers south of Dublin. And you may remember Arklow from the second slide of this presentation, which is the place where the Save Maritime Arklow campaign happened. So we did this right when the campaign was ongoing. And we did talk to some people involved with that campaign as well, trying to understand why is there resistance to change here, and why are people citing cultural value as a reason to resist. So we put it out everywhere, posters, calls on social media, etc. We did a snowball sampling campaign. It was a short project, so we had to do the quick and dirty method, put it that way. But it worked well. And some of the things we found really interesting. So we found very different functions that people associate with coastal environments. So this is one of the findings. I would be very happy if nobody ever walked on the beach besides me ever again, but I suppose it's not really okay. So this is just one of many quotes, right? But it shows the value of this kind of research. It's all too often do we skip to quantitative research where we only do statistics. Or we even do what I did here and pull it out of context. Because the person I interviewed here told me in the same interview that she was a cancer survivor. And she went to the beach to recover, think, reset, feel at ease, and feel physically well. She said it was the only thing she could do during her cancer treatment, is to go onto the beach and reclaim it for herself. So that's a very personal reason. And and she realized it almost excludes community use of the beach. Everybody else can get off. I'm here to walk. And it's fair enough in many ways, but she also realized it probably doesn't work that way. And that's just one example, right? So we find here, for instance, individual attachment to coastal environment, or nurtured by the coast. I think I would kind of put it in that category. But we also found that's an example of personal fulfillment. But on the other side, we found that people were using coastal places as nexus of communities. It's almost the opposite. This is what this participant did not want, other people on the beach, right? So what we did is we put it all together. Now, don't ask me to explain this. I can't do any stats. Somebody else put this together for me and told it was legit. So we'll go with it. No, but what this shows is, and it confirms this. First of all, every dot here is an individual who took part in our study. We combined the qualitative and the quantitative information, so it's a mixed method study. And we found, first of all, that there is really no difference, if you look at the two ellipses, between a preference for natural or constructed environments. So that's actually kind of interesting already, because I would immediately jump to the conclusion, anyone will prefer a natural environment over constructed. Just because it's natural beauty, I'll go with that. Turns out that's not necessarily true. And what was much more important, and it wasn't age, gender, it didn't matter, right, for the constructed or natural environment. It was almost a complete overlap between these ellipses. What's much more important was the different particular functions that people associate with particular places. And you can see what we saw earlier. There's a huge difference between personal fulfillment, so you can see the arrows pull in different directions, or coastal places next to communities. So we found that it was more the cultural function that people associated with a place that was important, and not whether it was natural or constructed, etc. So the first one I've already discussed, they didn't visit natural rather than constructed environments, and also the second thing, and the third thing I've actually discussed all of this already. So what that means is, because you could say, okay, well, you talk to everyone, what do you think about the coast? You love it, great, for personal or community reasons. But it actually reveals something really interesting about the impact of place change. So another person we talked to had been actively involved with a campaign to redevelop the local coastal walk. So she said, look, it was a safety concern, it wasn't the best place to be, it was a gorgeous walk, but it wasn't great, it could be better. Then they got the money, the place was improved, and then she was really angry because she said, now there's too many people there. Because it got really popular because it's so good now. So it's a similar thing, right? So she wanted to use it for personal reasons, but she had actually, and she said, I suppose it can't be helped, but at the same time, she never went anymore because she said, now it's overrun with people. Other people that I spoke to were really positive. They were like, oh, it's really improved, and we go with the family, we see all our friends there. That place did not change from natural to constructed. It was still a largely natural place because there wasn't that much constructed. It was just a couple of sort of boundary fences in place and some steps. So the place character did not change, but the cultural function changed, and that impacted on people, and it led to people either not going anymore or being disappointed. And that's the main thing we took away from this study, is that if you start changing the landscape, to go back to ecosstructure, for instance, if you start changing the landscape, you have to look at cultural function, rather than, for instance, just go, oh, we always need to keep it natural. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, not too far, to the second case study, because I see I've only got 5 minutes left. Second case study was one I did together with Mark and Geertje as well, actually. And this was a case study on the public perception of the seabed. Now, it was an oddly specific topic, but there was a reason for that, because when Ireland launched its natural marine planning framework, it said that the government indicated a couple of coastal areas that you can see on the slide there that were very likely to contain very large accumulations of organic carbon in sediments on the seabed. So just stuff that accumulates over time, right? Fertilizer runoff, algae, fish that die, break down. What that means is that stuff contains an awful lot of carbon, and it should be protected. But it also potentially means that other activities that take place in those coastal areas might not be able to go ahead with it anymore. Bottom trawling, so fishing, maybe wind farm development. It leads to the odd scenario where potentially you might be better off holding off building a wind turbine, because the minute you start drilling into the ground, you've lost so much carbon that you're on the back foot for a year or two. Don't quote me on the time span, but it's counterintuitive, right? So there's a lot going on in a coastal area. Then you go to a coastal community and say, actually, we have a topic here that you've never heard about. And it means that it's so important that suddenly you can't do all the activities that you're already doing. So when Mark got the funding to study this as a geoscientist, he was told this has potentially very large social implications, which means you need to start also doing a social community study, which is what I did. So we wanted to start talking to people without having all the answers, because Mark is not finished with the research. It's very much an emerging area of research. We didn't have all the answers. We had to talk to people about something they didn't know, yet we had to understand how they might react. It was quite a complicated study, right? At the same time, by doing this very early, it gives you an opportunity to really bring the community into the conversation, which is not always done, because often the conversation with the community only happens after the fact. So it was a challenge, but also a great opportunity. So a couple of problems to navigate. First of all, how do we engage with the public on marine unknowns? That's challenging, right? So how do we talk to people about something they might not be aware of? And how do we capture the role of speculation? Because we thought people are very likely going to guess or fill in the blanks, which is what I would do. If somebody said, look, what do you know about the seabed? Well, I know a couple of things about the seabed. What do you think about sediments on the seabed? Well, I can give you some ideas that I think are the case. So we came up with the hypothesis that it's very likely that people are going to rely on things they do know. So they know the coastal environment, they know the sea. Some people are fishermen, or they might be working in the Coast Guard, or might work in redevelopment. They know the seabed as well. And then they're going to rely on that to develop new meanings that with an unfamiliar environment, so what they don't know. So they're going to fill in the blanks between those two things to give some kind of idea of what these sediments are. So that's how we went about it. We first talked to people generally about the offshore environment, what they knew, and then we started talking about ideas and concerns about the marine sediments. One challenge as well was it really was not feasible to bring Mark, for instance, to these conversations simply because he knows too much. It would lead to a discussion in which people would say, well, you tell me, you're the geoscientist, even though Mark doesn't have all the answers either. So I went, and the first thing I said was, I haven't a clue, right? So I did an English degree, what do I know? Let's have a conversation. And that worked really well. So people were quite open, and I didn't challenge anyone on anything. I was just listening, because any perception is valid. It doesn't have to be tested. If you believe it's true, it's something you carry with you, so I will listen. We did this in Dundalk, which is north of Dublin, in Dundalk Bay, and it's a very busy economic area, and it's one of the areas that was identified in that diagram that I showed you earlier. So that's the reason we picked it. Same thing as earlier. So here are some of the findings that we had. Again, community connection, something we saw in ecostructure as well, that people followed their community, as I'm quoting here, drawing from the bay, the different communities, not just Dundalk town, but some of the smaller towns along the coast as well. People were very adamant that you had to strike the correct balance between protecting nature and the economy. So somebody said, it's probably the balance of looking after the bay, particularly from a biodiversity aspect, and also using it as an asset for tourism, for leisure, for the economy. So it's that balance. So people didn't immediately jump, said protect the sediments at all costs, or said no, protect the fisheries at all costs. Now everybody's weighing the options in their mind. Very important to take a careful approach to sediment management. So it's a longer quote, I won't read it out entirely, but so essentially they said, and I quote the last bit, I think if you don't know, well then you leave it alone until you kind of understand more about it. You don't go and destroy and then realize, well, that was a bad idea. The last bit was ad-libbing. And very important, community involvement in decision making. People wanted to be part of the conversation. And the quote there, it's critical that people feel part of any change that's going to happen in that relationship with the bay. So it was good to do that research, right? And to engage with people on this. Do I have a few more minutes?
You're exactly at half an hour.
Okay, so I'll go over. So just a couple of things that we got out of it. Place meaning, very strong connections between people and the bay on loads of different dimensions, right? Culture, economic, environmental. We also found great experiential knowledge. I think sometimes in these kind of studies there is the assumption that people haven't a clue and the scientists are always right. It's a wrong assumption. People know their environment extremely well. And one of the really cool things we found, so Mark put this together, is if you look on the maps, the two maps there, the one on the right is the official Infomar database, but it's paid for by the Irish government, and it's run by the Marine Institute. And that's research vessels going out at sea and collecting data about the types of sediment in Dundalk Bay. Now, what you see there is a thin white line between the research data and the coastline, and it's called the white ribbon, Mark, am I saying right? The white ribbon is where it gets too shallow, so the research vessel can no longer collect any information because it will run ashore. During some of the interviews, we got people who started drawing on the maps. And we didn't ask them to only do that part, but they only did effectively the white ribbon, because that was the area they knew from walking the coast, being in the Coast Guard, being involved with fishing, looking at the sonar in bottom trawling industries that go very close to shore. So we actually were able to fill in some of the gaps in the white ribbon. No, we didn't fact check whether that's accurate, but just the fact that people know their environment, so I'm pretty confident this is accurate. But it would be, we were talking about it earlier, great for a follow-up study, right? Citizen science, experiential knowledge of the white ribbon. And then we found that the last two that already came out to the quotes, new topic for research in the public. People said, look, I don't know everything about this, and they wanted to be involved in decision making. So to wrap up, we've created a policy brief for this. You can see it at this link if you're interested. We also did a library event in January of this year to feedback to people, to come back, look, we asked you for your input, here's what we found. So very important to avoid something like parachute science, where you just come in and take what you want and leave. We came back and explained, this is what we found, these are some of the recommendations that you made. And we have a follow-up, we did a follow-up study then later on, which is still ongoing. So that's everything I had. It was a bit of a whirlwind, but yeah, any questions, let me know.